All right, so thank you. I just want to say thank you to Peter and Gary for organizing this and having me on. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but excited to talk to you all today. So the title of the paper is Crowded Skies, which is a little bit of a misnomer in the sense that I'm going to be talking about what we think of as sort of multi-domain or all-domain concerns around UAPs. First thing I should say is that none of the things I'm going to discuss are classified. I don't have any interesting or cool proprietary information, and I only represent my own opinions and judgments. And really what I'm going to try to do today is provide a kind of framework for thinking about the UAP issue in the global and geopolitical context. So what are we confronting, and why is it that right now I think is a really critical juncture to think about trying to move forward? Because of my area in alternative futures, and I would do that by trying to give you an overlay of what I see as the major drivers for the complications in dealing with UAP issues, particularly at the level of international cooperation, but I think also at the level of domestic cooperation and democratic accountability, and then work through 4 sort of generic futures that I think that are all possible, even if the sort of probabilities I think are distinguishable, and show where I think that we really have some real policy paradoxes or policy sort of deadlocks. And then at the very end, I'm going to give you some conclusions about ways I think that we could move forward. Because I think we're in a little bit of a cul-de-sac where we're very excited about the possibility of more transparency, particularly by the United States. But I don't think that we really have anything like a policy agenda or a way forward for even what the sort of release of that information would mean or do. So I want to start with, why are the skies crowded? What does it mean to think about the kind of current context that we're in? What we might think about as the kind of risk-threat ecosystem. And the first thing I'll say is that all of the claims I'm going to make are identity agnostic. So I think these are major critical policy questions and agenda items, both for the United States and for the international liberal order, irrespective of where UAPs come from. And there's 2 reasons why I kind of want to work with that position. One, which is that I think sometimes we don't move forward on establishing a kind of greater or larger policy agenda because we're so caught in the question of how to do disclosure. And the second is that problem of attribution, I think, is actually a major driver of many of the risks that we face. Why is it that we need to think about this problem? Why are the skies crowded, and in particular, why do we face major risks and threats? I think the first is that UAPs, by their nature, are intermittent, both in their causality and their attribution, which creates a kind of epistemological black hole for both policymakers as well as military strategists. And I think this sort of core central feature, the fact that they can move quickly, the fact they can go on and off radar and sonar, the fact that they seem to either exploit or accentuate what we might think about as a sort of patchwork sensor gap environment, really creates, I think, many risks moving forward. And in part, that's because we also live in a low trust environment. And I think nationally, we see that with a sort of declining trust by civil society of public institutions, the trust that the information being given to them has any particular veracity at all. I think we also live in an extraordinarily low trust international environment. I don't think we've ever had the kind of, really honestly, since the beginning of the Cold War, we haven't had the sort of lack of either bilateral or international constraints on geopolitical competition. So many of the efforts that we made during the Cold War to de-threat or de-risk interactions between the Soviet Union and the United States have mostly crumbled, particularly with the Ukrainian war. And I think similarly, because of the way that China now asserts itself, both in terms of air power and sea power, we don't have particularly good measures for building confidence. And that just becomes exponentially more true when we start sort of leaving traditional domains like air power and sea power and thinking about outer space. So major drivers, I think the first one, which we have to take very seriously, is international competition. So in the last 10 years, but certainly even more so in the last 5 years, we have increasing numbers of what we think of as provocative air encounters, whether or not that's Russia flying bombers extraordinarily close to territorial airspace in Alaska, whether or not that's US and Chinese fighters flying dangerously close to one another in the sort of ongoing disputes about the South China Seas, or it's ocean disputes, right? It's the US trying to promote freedom of navigation in those same island chains and facing real confrontations with the Chinese Navy, or the fact that Chinese diesel submarines and US nuclear submarines are sort of not paired well to compete against one another. They have different kinds of capabilities that increase risks of accidents, but also risks for kind of asymmetrical competition, meaning we're not exactly playing the same game. And in that low trust environment, that carries a number of risks too. I think that's, sort of triply true of outer space, where, the sort of bipolar competition of the Cold War is now not just a sort of tripolar competition between Russia, China, and the United States, but there are a number of new actors in space programs, as well as commercial actors, which potentially challenge that. And I think that's what makes all of these domains sort of uniquely crowded. They're all dual use spaces, meaning that there is no domain any longer, whether it be outer space, whether it be the ocean or airspace, for which the military, the sort of commercial enterprise, as well as something we often forget, which is the fact that all of these spaces, at least at a particular elevation in the case of airspace, and for much of outer space, are commons, meaning that they belong to the world heritage in a way that was established in the Outer Space Treaty and the Seabed Mining Treaty. That sort of characteristic means we have all of these overlapping institutions, right? We have assemblages of different kinds of control regimes, assemblages of different kinds of sensory arrays, and oftentimes conflicting and certainly not cooperating assemblages of information gathering and uneven information sharing. And that's a second major driver I think we have to consider, which is that there is a real commercial sensor gap and lack of information sharing. We are relatively good regionally when dealing with things like air traffic control, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But even in those cases, we don't have the kinds of seamless, what we think of as commercial or civilian networks to ensure that we can even distinguish between a UAP and other kinds of issues, like a plane that it's off its approved path. And that leads to the third major driver, which I think we really have to consider, which is proliferation. So, in the last 2 decades, the number of aerial vehicles has just increased exponentially. Whether it's the fact that almost every major power and most middle powers depend heavily on unpersoned vehicles, right? Drones of various kinds, both for surveillance, for attack, and also for scientific research. You combine that with the increased scrutiny and securitization of air traffic control, that both commercial and private flight is seen as a potential threat, right? In the post sort of September 11th world, you really see a level of scrutiny both at the commercial and private level, as well as at the military level. And then the last, when we start entering into the outer space domain, is that we have all of those problems, commercial and military crowding. We have, increasingly fewer numbers of slots for satellites. But the area of space junk is actually one that is really important, right? So we have a problem of being able to both track as well as abate the garbage left behind in space, which can be incredibly disruptive, right? Very small objects at high velocities can do an incredible amount of damage to either existing platforms like satellites, which we depend upon for commercial communication, or satellites which we depend upon for the kind of mutual transparency that states have, which has a real constraining effect on crisis escalation. So, if you can't see each other's nuclear silos, or you don't have a good sense of where troop movements are happening, then we see these sort of escalating areas of paranoia. So that's sort of the world we live in, where There's low levels of trust. The United Nations is in my estimation, sort of the weakest that it's ever been as a fora for even the great powers to settle disputes. And we just have this explosion of all domain commercial vehicles. So to try to think through what that could look like as potential, 10-year or 20-year sort of outlays of possible scenarios, I'm going to use what we call an alternative futures methodology. And I want to say a couple of quick things about what that is. It's not foresight. So these are not predictions about where we'll be in 10 and 20 years. This is an effort to provide images of the future that tell us something about our lack of preparedness to possible futures rather than probable futures. And there are a few kind of methodological reasons for this, which I think are really important, and in particular in the case of UAPs, because they represent, again, such an epistemological black hole for policymaking, both because of just the lack of scientific research, but also because of the political motivations for maintaining that black hole. In fact, we could almost say that we have two different kinds of black holes, and we don't know how to distinguish them. One is a kind of epistemological black hole where we don't have enough information. There's not enough data to reach strong conclusions. And the other one we could think of as a kind of cloaked black hole, where there's actually a strategic advantage. There's a real strategic investment in maintaining the opaque nature of these events. So why futures? The first is that, at least in the Hawaii school, called Manoa School of Alternative Futures, we don't believe the future exists, meaning initial conditions now do not determine all possibilities in the future. Whether that's at the level of physics, and you're sort of in the Copenhagen school of the gold slit experiment, you think that there's real novelty and chance in the sort of wave-particle duality problem, all the way to kind of the social sciences, whether or not you think that initial conditions or structures like economics or other sort of structuring principles limit or really change the future very much. And in part, that's because we think that rules change. Taking a little bit from the philosopher David Hume, there's a paradox of empiricism, which is by definition, empiricism is always old data. It's data from the past. It can't be possible data about the future, which means we make assumptions or metaphysical leaps every time we presume that the data we've gathered is predictive of the data we expect to find. And that works for us most of the time. It's something like gravity or the sort of behavior of an electron. But it becomes very dangerous when we're dealing with systems where we're not sure if we're dealing with a law or we're dealing with a rule. The problem is that rules change. And in fact, oftentimes what we discover is that laws aren't laws. They're merely rules for which we haven't yet experienced its possibility for alteration. The third part is that possible futures rather than probable futures are more significant for making policy decisions. Probable futures very rarely need significant political investment because they are already expectations for how the future can play out. Possible futures allow us to diagnose the fact that overconfidence or a lack of preparation can create major institutional pitfalls. And another way of putting that is sort of our fourth mantra for alternative futures is that certainty is more dangerous than uncertainty, meaning confidence that existing institutions or existing protocols are sufficient to sort of either deter or contain low probability but high consequence events is really an error, particularly if an event literally changes the boundaries of what we think is possible, meaning it's already outside of how we normally think about probability. And I think UAPs fall squarely in that mode, in particular because of the sort of two black hole problem, but also because they pose such a challenge to both physics and technical capability, as well as attribution, which cuts to the heart of what I'll talk about in a second, which is the sort of problem of the security dilemma, meaning how states interact. Okay, that combined with the fact that I think what I'm going to try to argue is that we're pretty trapped right now, I think, at a policy level in three different paradigms of UAPs. The first is a kind of capture engagement paradigm. These are the people that hope that we can either recover a vehicle, we can engage a vehicle, strategic thinkers who think that we could shoot down or have countermeasures against vehicles. And I think this approach in particular is incredibly zero-sum, but drives behavior. We're going to talk about that in each of the futures, the way that combined with the other sort of larger structural drivers, could present real consequences for not taking the UAP as a sort of core central question for policymaking. The second paradigm, which I think is also we're in a bit of a rut on in terms of policymaking, is the disclosure paradigm. In part because it puts us into an incredibly us versus them relationship, both with our own governments, right? We see that already in the negotiations that are being made between AERO and the Congress, between private citizens and organizations like Seoul and both of those actors, but also an us versus them paradigm with all of the other UAP programs, right? Whether or not that's China, Russia, or India, where the questions of disclosure are very rarely about constitutional accountability or the particular scientific value of disclosure, and they're often about whether or not there's sort of first mover advantages or not, right? Meaning they think about those questions both in political and geopolitical terms rather than what we'll call later functional terms. And the last is we still very much have a paradigm that is alive and well in discourse of pretend nothing is happening. And I think that is in some sense the most dangerous, right? It shows that there's an expectation that either UAPs will become less relevant, which none of the data suggests, or that there's nothing really there to be concerned about at all. I want to propose a kind of fourth paradigm where we remain institutionally and sort of politically agnostic about what UAPs are, and do our best to think about ways in which there could be international cooperation, collaboration that avoids the kind of high politics of the military and sort of more geopolitical, even diplomatic relationships. And this comes from international relations theorist from the first half of the 20th century named David Matrani, who decided that sometimes we actually should avoid the big issues, meaning, right, what are UAPs? Or how is the United States and China going to sign a treaty to restrict the experimentation or use of UAP technology? Because those issues are sort of so highly fraught with sort of larger, deeper structural issues about geopolitical competition that making progress on them requires, in some sense, a whole transformation of the international order. That instead, if we want to sort of build up, create a kind of gradualism, we should start with low stakes politics. And I'll get into that in the conclusion, but I want that kind of in the back of your mind while I think through these four futures. So in all cases, in alternative futures, we always use the same four. And the reason for that is that these are diagnostic tools, not predictions. So we talk about collapse futures. That's where the sort of order that we currently live in, for some reason, loses the capacity to maintain its capabilities of authority and legitimacy, and everything breaks down. Discipline futures, where we have possible or partial collapses, and the state has to reassert itself not through legitimacy, but through authority or its use of force. 3, transformation futures, where some fundamental assumption, some fundamental rule to how the entire international order or political order is structured, that one of those rules changes, and we really see the system as a result change. And then 4th, the one that sounds the most boring but is often the most useful, is what we call a continued growth future. What if nothing changes, right? The level of disclosure, the number or frequency of UAPs continues as it is. What kind of future does that look like? So I'm going to start with the collapse future. And I think this one, again, this isn't about probability, but this one, I think, poses real problems that could be of high risk. So imagine a world where we have a major catastrophe. A UAP event takes place during a time of crisis in a territorial space. And this could happen in any domain, right? So it can either be territorial because it's in territorial airspace, it could be in territorial waters, it could be in disputed territories like the South China Sea or Taiwan, or it could happen in the sort of highly crowded area of outer space where there are really high value assets like surveillance satellites. Now, if there's already an existing conflict there, the speed at which UAPs can move and the unpredictability from which they can be tracked and their ability to cross domains, whether or not that's from water to air or air from out to outer space, could create crisis escalation. Meaning if it blinds a system in outer space, that could be perceived by one of the competitors as an anti-satellite attack. Those kinds of attacks is are the kinds of things that create escalating potential nuclear conflicts, in part because our nuclear security is so dependent upon being able to see one another. It could be a case where we have a standoff, like the Cuban Missile Crisis over Taiwan, and a mid-air collision, a submarine being struck by a UAP, some other kind of mishap, or even just the radar expectation, right? So think Gulf of Tonkin, where the United States is literally chasing its own sonar shadow in particularly stormy weather. These kinds of events are actually likely to spur wars, right? They pose a major safety crisis. And because of the drivers, because there's such a low trust environment, they're not likely to de-escalate. As a result, I think collapse futures present really serious consequences. So if this happens in outer space, even just a few satellites exploding, if that leads to counterattacks or reprisals, we could see an exponential increase in space junk that could literally make space inaccessible, right? We could enter a world where we cannot predictably track space junk, either because of its size or the number of different objects, such that we don't have the ability to get launch vehicles with any kind of predictability. Or we can, but because the windows are so small, we start to see them being policed, right? We start to see a kind of competition over those narrow windows. I think that could actually be quite catastrophic, right? I think that risks potential nuclear escalation, accidental nuclear weapons. I think that could produce naval escalations. If it were in the sea domain and it involves submarines, that could be either nuclear or conventional. So future number 2, discipline future. Imagine a commercial event, a UAP mid-collision, either at sea or air, or the loss of major infrastructure in space, the loss of life, given the ways in which that could drive tensions between states. Depending on the domain, if this takes place, say, in outer space or in airspace, we could see further erosion of the Aerospace Treaty, the Law of the Sea Treaty, which I think is already sort of on the brink because of territorial disputes, both between the United States and Russia over seabeds and where the continental shelf is, or freedom of navigation disputes between the United States and China, or in outer space where we really do see quite a bit of competition and sort of states on the precipice of whether or not to abandon the 1968 Outer Space Treaty and really move from militarization of space to weaponization of space. If that were to happen, we could see potential losses in the commercial system, right? Freedom of navigation is essential to the sort of supply chain world we exist in. We could see reprisals in outer space that could disrupt international communication. And we could just see a general degrading of the process by which states are able to collaborate, even to the limited extent they are now. I think in that kind of environment, we would likely see an increase in state secrecy, right? States would become paranoid about whether or not other states have been involved. Were these UAPs? Were these actually just kill vehicles from various states? And that would be, I think, an undesirable future. So number 3, transformation future. I think this can take one of 2 forms. One is asymmetrical disclosure. A single state decides to disclose everything they know about UAPs. I think this would significantly increase interstate competition. I think that there would be a kind of race to see if we could meet a gap in knowledge. I think domestically and internationally, we would see an increase in conspiracy theories. And in general, we would see a growing level of distrust because it would be very difficult to know whether or not the side that disclosed was disclosing truth or was using strategic communication. And we'd end up potentially also for a kind of race for what's left. So a state were to disclose in a way that suggested that one side or the other had a certain kind of capability, the ability to reverse engineer, the ability to make use of a new propulsion system, some new kind of cloaking system, then I think we would see what we call the security dilemma, which is that no matter the intention of the state in competition, the presumption of capability on the other side of the competition line always produces a sense of insecurity. So even technologies that we think of as being useful for defense can very quickly be perceived by the other side as offense. Because from the other position, it's impossible to tell the difference between offense and defense in the capability of winning a war. B, sort of ex-party non-human disclosure. So what if we have UAPs disclose themselves and it turns out to not be any of the competitive actors in the system? I think this would also lead to potentially hostile actions between states. The security dilemma would be further magnified because there would be no diplomatic relations, no framework for understanding the actor. And again, that offense-defense paradigm would not hold. We would presume that all capabilities that were in excess of currently existing state capabilities were by definition a threat. And I think that would also lead to potentially escalating conflicts. Certainly lead to the panic of populations. Lastly, continuing growth model. So in this world, imagine a future where we have frequent non-transformational UAP events. Basically what we have now, what someone in the audience was calling blurry images, right? We have a series of blurry images and encounters. And with that, I think we would maintain continued levels of secrecy by all states. I think that would create a kind of opaque character, which I think is what is creating the kind of drivers for competition between states. I also think that that's what creates the opportunity for the kinds of accidents I described in the other futures. B, likely to see weaponization and restrictions on outer space domains and significant erosions of norms, right? If we keep having these events and they're happening in multiple territories and we can't sort of resolve either of the black holes, right, the epistemological black hole or the cloaked black hole, then I think that actually drives the weaponization of space. Right, that drives censor sort of arms races and also potentially sabotage, spoofing, and the effort to try to strategically use those geopolitically. And I think in general, that position also leads to internal erosion of civil society state trust, right? Something that I already think is a crisis. A continued growth future, if we do nothing, if we just allow things to continue to go as they are, I think it's a roll of the dice of it becoming any of the other non-desirable futures. All right, so in conclusion, here are the things I want to say about how we could think about maybe moving forward. Is I don't think that if this is driven either by a single state or driven by UAPs themselves, we have particularly good futures to look forward to, given the international system we live in. So what could we do? I think in all of these futures, it's a lack of international competition and a lack of transparency and democratic accountability that creates a significant hazards for planetary life. Meaning it's the fact that every misattribution or every sort of opaque situation where we can't have attribution or knowledge, we interpret as a threat, right? We are in a kind of threat paradigm. Two, existing frameworks are not likely to provide solutions. If state interest and state secrecy and a monopoly over knowledge is driving political behavior and policymaking, we are only more likely to accelerate that competition as well as these overlapping networks, right? That intersection with security means that high politics is likely to drive this political decision-making, and we're not likely to see cooperation. Three, the lack of appreciation of danger, that sort of head in the sand perspective, is increasing the likelihood of preferring freedom of action over cooperation. Because we don't appreciate the kinds of safety challenges that UAPs can have, states have very little incentive, even at the civilian and commercial level, to think about information sharing or collaboration. So I think there's a real role to play to think less about kind of military or security consequences of UAPs and think about the very banal and very significant way that not addressing them and not having a framework for studying and tracking them could interrupt either the commercial sector and the global economy or the international communication network or the international travel network. So I think all of the existing paradigms for that reason are highly problematic. Kind of capture engagement paradigm is likely to drive arms races, particularly if it's a kind of X-race or non-human disclosure. I think the disclosure paradigm where one state discloses either partial or all things increases insecurity. And finally, if we ignore, then all possible futures become challenging. So last point, what if we try a functionalist paradigm? Instead of focusing on security or even disclosure as a kind of ontological transformation, we focus on safety the way we did with air traffic control. We could focus on freedom of navigation, commerce, freedom of movement, where we see lots of converging interests between states. The same way we did with the postal system, the same way we did with air traffic control, the international standards on passports, where because states have so much investment in the system being functional, they're less likely to think in competitive terms. I think trying to build those kinds of institutions for UAPs to try to deconflict these areas is what's necessary for a kind of all planetary safety regime, filling sensor gaps, not necessarily with the clarity of those sensors, but with information sharing and trying to build low-level cooperation, either at the civilian level, the commercial level, or even the amateur level. So we have some kind of framework to break out of what I think is fundamentally right now a kind of militarized paradox of knowledge. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.